Dubro Suspicion Files.
All right, today we're cracking open a declassified case file. We're looking at a U.S. government program with a a deceptively simple name, Operation Paperclip. So let's just jump right in with the big one. Was the moon landing, one of humanity's absolute greatest achievements? Was it powered by Nazi science? That's a huge question, right? And the answer, well, it's a lot more complicated and honestly a lot more disturbing than you probably think. Okay, so let's start with the hard facts. What was Operation Paperclip? Well, it was a top-secret U.S. program, and it ran for about 14 years right after World War II ended. The whole mission was pretty straightforward, at least on paper. Recruit and bring over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to come work for the U.S. government. And the name Paperclip? Why call it that? Well, it's because that's literally how the cover-up worked. It's almost unbelievably simple. Agents would take these old, incriminating files on the scientists and just paperclip a new, squeaky clean set of immigration papers right on top. So yeah, the deception was baked into the name from day one. So for this explainer, I want you to be the jury. The case we're looking at is this. Was Operation Paperclip a necessary evil? Just a pragmatic move for national security in a brand new, dangerous world? Or was it a deal with the devil? A deal that put actual war criminals at the very heart of America's most secret projects? Let's dig into the evidence. Okay, first up, let's hear from the prosecution. This is the conspiracy indictment. So, the first major claim is what's called the infiltration hypothesis. And the idea here isn't that the U.S. just, got a little help. No, the theory is that our entire space program was basically co-founded by Nazis. And Exhibit A, well, it's the most famous name on the whole list, Wernher von Braun. The contrast here is just staggering. On one hand, he was a documented SS officer. On the other, he was the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, the rocket that took us to the moon. And he became the first director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. We're not talking about some low-level engineer here. This guy was at the absolute top. And it doesn't stop there. Let's look at Exhibit B, a guy named Kurt Debus. CIA files from back then literally described him as an ardent Nazi. And what was his job in the U.S.? Oh, just the first director of the NASA Launch Operations Center at Cape Canaveral? You can see how the conspiracy argument just writes itself, right? The man who designed the rocket and the man who launched it, both from the Nazi Party? Okay, the second claim gets even darker. It's called the methodology transfer hypothesis. The theory here is that these scientists didn't just bring their knowledge of rockets. They brought their methods of unethical human experimentation. The idea is that there's a direct line you can draw from the horrors of concentration camps like Dachau straight to secret CIA programs like MKUltra. Now, look, as we start connecting these dots, von Braun, Debus, Dachau, MKUltra, our brains just naturally want to see a story. It's a built-in cognitive thing called patternicity. We're hardwired to find meaningful patterns even when they're not really there. And that's exactly why this conspiracy narrative feels so tight, so believable. But is it the whole story?
Well, to find that out, we've got to rewind. We have to look at what the world was like in 1945. And that brings us to the defense's argument, the race against the Soviets.
And right away, this is where we find the first major crack in the conspiracy theory. Because when you look at the documented motive for the program, it wasn't ideological. It wasn't pro-Nazi at all. The records are crystal clear on this. It was deeply pragmatic and geopolitical. It was all about being anti-Soviet.
See, the U.S. wasn't the only one shopping for German scientists. The Soviets had their own program going on, but their methods were, well, very different. The U.S. used recruitment, gave them contracts, and treated them like colleagues. The Soviets, they used abduction at gunpoint and treated them like prisoners. So the American approach wasn't some kind of friendly alliance. You could argue it was just a much more effective way of exploiting their talent, which is what led to long-term success, like Apollo.
So if it wasn't about ideology, what was the motive for making such a massive moral compromise? It was pure utility. The estimated value, just in patents and industrial processes that the U.S. got from this program, was $10 billion. And that's in post-war money. This wasn't about beliefs. It was a cold, calculated investment, plain and simple. Okay, so let's put these two ideas head to head, the conspiracy theory versus the actual documented government policy. And this is a really critical distinction to make. The conspiracy theory talks about an infiltration, right? A hostile act against the state. But the documented truth, it shows a recruitment, a sanctioned, top-down policy that was created by the state. And in a way, that's almost more disturbing. The government wasn't the victim of a trick. It was the one pulling the strings. And if you need a smoking gun, here it is. It's a memo from 1948, written by a Captain Wexon, the director of the agency actually running Paperclip. He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "To continue to treat Nazi affiliations as significant considerations has been aptly phrased as beating a dead Nazi horse." He flat out argued that the far greater threat of communism was the only thing that mattered. I mean, that's not a conspiracy theory. That is cynical, documented policy. So what about that link to MKUltra? This is where that patternicity thing we talked about can really trip us up. The truth is, the US government was already developing its own unethical mind control programs because they were terrified of Soviet brainwashing. The Paperclip scientists didn't create these programs from scratch, but with their experience from places like DACO, they were brought in as expert consultants to speed things up. They didn't start the fire, but they were absolutely brought in to pour gasoline on it. So if the grand conspiracy theory is really a distortion, what are we left with? Well, now we have to confront the unavoidable facts. You know, in a lot of ways, the conspiracy theory is kind of a distraction from the real issue. The moral compromise, on the other hand, is an undeniable, documented fact. So let's take a hard look at the men the US government decided were worth the price. Let's go back to Wernher von Braun, the celebrated hero, the architect of the moon rocket. But before he built the Saturn V, he built the V2 rocket for Germany. And that rocket was built using slave labor in the Mittelwerk factory. More than 20,000 concentration camp prisoners died building it. Just let that sink in. More people died building his rocket than were killed by the rocket when it was actually used as a weapon. Or how about Arthur Rudolph? He was the project director for the Saturn V rocket program. And he didn't just know about the slave labor. There's a memo from 1943 that shows he personally recommended using it. Fast forward decades later to 1984. To avoid a public war crimes trial, Rudolph was forced to give up his U.S. citizenship. It was a stunning and very late admission of guilt by the U.S. government. So, the case file is closed. The conspiracy of a secret Nazi infiltration, it's largely fiction. But the reality of a sanctioned government policy to whitewash the past of war criminals just to get a technological edge, that's a fact. And so, the verdict comes back to you, the jury. Was this a pragmatic, necessary evil to win the Cold War, or was it a foundational moral compromise that set a dangerous new standard for national security? The judgment is yours.